only game I've ever played that's designed to make it easy, and in some ways even encourage you to be bad at it. It's remarkably easy to be awful at Overwatch, and as I dove back in on a fresh, unranked PC account to see how the game has changed, I was hit with a startling realization. Overwatch's popularity has everything to do with it almost conditioning bad behavior. Now, that's not to say it's not a good game. That's not at all what I'm saying. What I am saying is this manifests itself in a bit of a paradox, and today I want to break that paradox down. In Overwatch's quest to become accessible, it simultaneously makes some of the most ingenious design decisions in multiplayer gaming, while also managing to, in similar ways, prohibit the growth of its players. If the point of a competitive multiplayer game is to get better, Overwatch is significantly more concerned with giving you reasons to feel like you don't really have to. Let me be clear, this is both a great and not so great reality of the game, but it's one that does not apply to high-level play. Good players are using these heroes dramatically differently than anything I'm discussing here. So heed that warning. I think to understand why and how this is, it's important to first get some context as to the game's strange MMO roots. Overwatch's success is actually a bit surprising given that the game was born out of total and complete failure. A game known as Titan began development around early 2007 within Blizzard. It was a class-based shooter, with each class having a core set of abilities that the player would expand upon via a skill tree progression, much like an RPG. These skills got more powerful the further the player progressed, and these systems became more nuanced. Jeff Kaplan, a lead on Titan, said that it ended up being very cluttered and confused. Blizzard co-founder Michael Morhaime stated that with Titan, they didn't find the fun, they didn't find the passion, even after re-evaluating the project years down the line. And thus, after nearly 7 years of development, energy, money, and time, Titan was completely scrapped. The large Titan team of 140 development members was broken up. 80 were permanently relocated to other divisions in Blizzard, 20 put on loan to other Blizzard projects, and the remaining 40 tasked to come up with a new project within just 6 weeks, otherwise they too would be assigned to other groups within Blizzard. This team of 40 spent those 6 weeks tossing around many ideas. One was an MMO, another was a StarCraft tie-in, and eventually, the team came to a realization. They wanted to do something new. They wanted to take the state of the modern FPS, the rising MOBA genre, and combine the two and innovate on both to create something unique. Thus, Overwatch was born. The game was built utilizing a different development approach than other shooters, and it's part of the reason Overwatch became different than other shooters. The game from the bottom up has always been hero first. Development started with the creation of the first hero, Tracer, who is based on a character meant to exist within the cancelled Titan. They set Tracer in the first map, Temple of Anubis, and began testing gameplay around this foundation. Widowmaker, Reaper, and Pharaoh would follow, each characters that would have been classes in the MMO idea tossed around before landing on Overwatch. And it was around this time that the idea of accessibility became a mantra of development. By the time Overwatch eventually hit store shelves, its mantra was intact, its development goals reached, and it would hit store shelves not in beta, not in early access, but as a complete and finished product. But is Overwatch anything more than just accessible? Is it anything more than the heroes within it? Is Overwatch worthy of the praise it has received? Let's take a look at the first thing that Overwatch does get right. Overwatch is split into 3 subclasses: tank, DPS or damage, and support. Each class has heroes designed from the ground up to be almost laughably easy to play and feel as though you're contributing whether you are or aren't. Let's start with the less obvious support choice, Moira, who you will see in basically every other match. This character is essentially a medal simulator. She requires only the most basic and imprecise aiming ability from the player, being that her damage beam, which is continuous, only requires you to aim near or around the body of an enemy to latch onto it automatically. Dealing damage becomes an exercise in looking towards an enemy, not directly at it. Her orb ability proffers a similar reality. Toss an orb towards the enemy team, and as long as it's reasonably well placed, you'll quickly hear that damage ticker ringing. The same applies to her wide healing beam and healing orb. She is designed to be able to be played by even the most mechanically inept and unskilled player. She's designed to reward you just for participating. It's easy to rack up medals simply by tossing orbs and holding right click. She's constantly proffering the player feedback by giving you constant trash damage and unearned limbs. She has a high skill ceiling. A good Mara can change a match, but you don't need to be good to feel like you are with this hero. There's a similar sentiment with Mercy, a hero whose beam just needs to be in the vicinity of an ally, a hero who can fly to an ally within her vision with a click of shift, and a hero who can even participate in damage dealing with her alt fire, which boosts the damage output to whoever you're aiming it at. The point with these two heroes isn't that they're easy to use. They are, but again, that isn't the point, because both have high skill ceilings and can be very difficult to use well. The point is instead that both are designed to make you feel like you're better than you are at lower levels. They're both designed to make it easy for you to feel like you're contributing, and by designing these heroes this way, their refusal to offer negative feedback gives you less incentive to learn from your mistakes, or better yet, even recognize them. If I die in Rainbow Six Siege, for example, I know why, and if I die right away in a round, I know I've hurt my team. I also have not contributed, or I've done so negatively. The scoreboard shows it. In COD, I know my KD isn't up to snuff, and I know that's eating into our score. Even in NBA 2K, I know that stupid deep 3 I took on the last possession cost my team that possession and the potential for points. The point is, I understand when I'm hurting my team in almost every other competitive game. Overwatch, on the other hand, designs heroes like Mercy and Mara to make that negative feedback almost non-existent and instead overwhelm you with positive reinforcement for every action. This creates two positives and a negative. First off, this makes the game a lot more fun and in some ways less toxic than other multiplayer games. It also makes the game more relaxing and encourages players to actually give the less popular hero roles, like support, a shot. But it also panders to the player in ways that don't stimulate your skill progression. Tanks are an even more interesting look at this design choice, however. This is Reinhardt. A really good Reinhardt can carry a match, can be the rock you need to progress past the next checkpoint. He can be your best friend. But anyone can play him, and that's a huge credit to the design team. Reinhardt is so simple to understand. Hold up your shield, protect your team. When it goes down, swing hammer or pin enemies, and repeat.
What?
But great players know how nuanced his actual strats are. Not everybody's a great player, and you don't have to be great with Reinhardt to have fun.
That's a lot of stuff.
Anyone can walk in front of the payload, shield up, and lay the hammer down on their enemies. There's no skill required in those realities. And if you're well supported and your DPSs do their job, you'll stay alive. Reinhardt is the right kind of easy to play. There's no overwhelming celebration of your actions every 10 seconds. It's protect and stay upright. No medals, fewer limbs, fun, but without your improvement, you'll never see an accolade. You'll never feel like you can't get better or don't need to. And then there's D.Va. Very high skill ceiling, again, but the ultimate trash damage accolade collecting medal getting tank. Simply in the context of ease of use. Great D.Va
still gotta learn how to use her defense matrix at the right time though.
Are doing nothing. D.Va's weapons have a massive spread and fairly reasonable range. And even once you get outside of the range of her wang weapons, enemies at a distance will still trigger that damage tick. Her dive mechanic can boot you right off the map for an easy kill, or at least deal some damage. Her ult is a ticking time bomb that can wipe a whole squad with skillful, or even lucky, placement, and most importantly, she lives multiple lives. See, while she can eat damage, inexperienced players forego her matrix and simply fire forever, racking up trash limbs, damage medals, and fly in and out of trouble without supporting their team. But even when they go down, they pop out of their mech, and pop shot until they got it back, and live their second life, rinse and repeat. D.Va's widespread, flashy ult flying mech is constantly rewarding you with positive feedback and does everything it can not to punish your mistakes. Requiring very little aiming skill while in mech and an easy way to get out of trouble with flight, D.Va is excellent in good hands, but in new hands, or even poor hands, she's designed to make you feel powerful, as she should be, but designed to make you feel, again, like you're contributing, even if you aren't. Designed to keep you alive for as long as possible, even if you aren't helping your team, even if that means exiting team fights. And she's everything you need to convince yourself that even if your team loses, it wasn't your fault, so I get better. You participated in over 60% of eliminations. You got a gold in hero damage. You got a gold in objective kills. It couldn't have been you. And Overwatch really drives all of this home in that presentation and progression. Overwatch made a design decision that the dev team cites as taking a stand against individual play in competitive games, but maybe created an altogether different, albeit more complex, beast. Well, really it was two decisions. Overwatch wants you to play the objective. It wants you to play as a team, but it also wants you to always run on a sugary high of positivity and in-game hurrahs. The game removed the KD statistic from both in-game and post-game menus. Better yet, a kill or elimination became the statistic shown, and to get one, you simply had to deal some amount of damage to the eliminated enemy at some point during the course of their current health pool. So even if you did just 13% of the damage to the Reinhardt, as long as he goes down, swinging or not, you've gotten that sweet elim message. And these are both excellent decisions. They do a wonderful and reasonable job of removing the focus on kill chasing, and better yet, removing
that was a
the
really
trait
good move
statistic,
by them.
not necessarily indicative of skill, from the game altogether by removing the traditional kill stat. But by creating the medal system in its place and making it almost impossible not to receive some medal by the end of the match, and by stacking on top of that the post-game accolade card system, they create a cycle of positive reinforcement that, while amazing in a world of multiplayer toxicity, also breeds complacency in skill. The underlying message of this piece. How many times have you heard someone say they should be ranked higher because they're always getting golds in X category or other category? Or they carried because they had 4 medals? Or their team was trash because they lost and he had gold limbs on support? Probably a lot. By making everyone feel like a success, you created a false sense of progress amongst low to mid-tier players. Now, smart players of any rank, even low ranks, know when and how they can improve. So this isn't everyone, but for far too many players, these accolades are viewed as reasons to blame others or reasons not to look inward at their own performance. They are silver because they're solo queuing and keep getting bad teammates, or worse yet, they become bad teammates chasing medals because they feel as though it separates them or will contribute to their placement. This all reaches its finale with a system that has apparently reduced toxicity in the game by 40% according to Blizzard, the endorsement system. This system is great because it clearly does encourage positivity and curb some of the more undesirable behavior, as Blizzard would probably put it, but it also rewards you with 50 XP every time you endorse someone else post-match, and it gives you 3 chances to do so. So, those looking to get 150 extra XP every single match, which at lower levels, to be a fair amount, will endorse anyone just for the XP, meaning a bunch of bad teammates are being reinforced as good teammates regardless of their play, further cementing their bad in-game habits. A system whose pros probably far outweigh its cons, but a system that does have its cons. Every day on forums and even blog posts, you'll see people arguing that either there's too big of a skill gap in Overwatch or there's not big enough of a skill gap. But for those in the camp believing there's too big of a skill gap, these realities are probably a pretty good contributor to that gap. They're probably a good reason why players lapse so often. And that's really the underlying sentiment of this. Overwatch does so much to make you feel like you're contributing, so much to make you feel like you're having a positive experience, and so much to provide a constant stream of that positivity, both visually and mechanically, that eventually that pomp and circumstance gives way to what at times feels like debilitating pandering that gets in the way of players understanding when they've done something wrong, or where they can get better, or when they're not really contributing to the success of their team, only the success of themselves. Now, this is far from all bad. I love that Overwatch is all about making you feel happy and involved, but it's hard to imagine these mechanics and design choices haven't also contributed to some of the toxicity, and that a good portion of the lapsed player base might be lapsing because these systems aren't as stimulating as they should be. Let me be clear, I still believe Overwatch is not only fun, but an excellent use of your time. Over the years, I've logged over 130 hours on console, and now dozens more on PC. While I don't consider myself a hardcore player or a core member of the Overwatch community, I do absolutely think the game is worth your time. This is not a video about a bad game being bad. It's a video about a good game and how its design decisions fight amongst each other to create something both special and strange. Overwatch is one of the most interesting cases of design paradoxes in gaming. Sometimes behind the smiles and the rainbows, in my opinion, there needs to be a little bit of rain, so you know how to stay atop those rainbows forever. Maybe, just maybe, Overwatch could every once in a while use a little drizzle. That is it for today's video, guys. As always, I want to know what you think. Are you still playing Overwatch? Are you going to pick it up on Switch? Are you interested in the game at all at this point? If you stopped playing it, why did you? If you aren't interested now, what is it about you that's got you uninterested? I know we were time to be talking about a Blizzard game, but this video has been in the works for weeks, as most of you know on Twitter. This all just kind of came at a weird time. But let me know what you think about Overwatch in general. Are you going to keep playing it? Are you going to keep supporting Blizzard? Let me know in the comments down below. As always, if you enjoyed this video, press the like button. If you have not yet subscribed, press that little subscribe button as well. That way you don't miss any content coming to this channel. Also, click the little bell next to the subscribe button. That little bell, just make sure that you're actually notified when videos come out. That's all it's for. Just make sure you actually receive them. Press that little bell next to the subscribe button. And until next time, guys, I'm out.
Last year, the lady I live with, also known as my wife, asked if she could try out one of the games I've been playing. She described it as the one with the cute little ghost guy, and after scrolling through my entire library, I realized she was talking about Hollow Knight. Given the fact that her experience with video games at that point consisted of the occasional race in Mario Kart and a smattering of Crash Bandicoot levels from when she was a kid, I knew with fair confidence that her playing Hollow Knight would go terribly. So obviously I booted it up and set her into the world of Hollow Knight. As she played, every moment, regardless of how seemingly insignificant, had a strange sort of intensity. For example, in the tutorial there are set platforms that the player needs to jump across. The only penalty for falling is a little bit of time, and on my first playthrough I breezed past it and immediately forgot about it. For her, it was intense beyond belief. She wasn't sure what the penalty for falling would be, and she didn't have a full grasp on how to adjust her jump height and distance. Each successful jump felt like a triumph, and after landing, she'd look out at the next platform, searching for the nerve to jump again. Watching her work through this early section and seeing the different ways that she viewed the game got me thinking a lot about the language of video games, and just how much a person's level of video game literacy affects their experience with the title. I can't really think of a time in my life where I wasn't interested in games, and because of that, there are certain aspects about them that are almost instinctual to me now. And that's because a lot of
Take it.
games
I don't
use the
care.
same ideas and vocabulary in order to get information across to
I'll take
players
it.
as quickly as possible. It's why the color red is almost always associated with health, why the A button or its equivalent is typically the command to jump, and why platformers more often than not have players moving from left to right. At this point, I've played enough games where after 5 minutes of trying a new one, I almost always know what to expect, no matter the kind of game. But that inherent understanding of how games work and what to expect from them doesn't exist for the lady I live with because she hasn't spent the time learning those things. And this made me wonder,
True.
how do people learn the basics of video games? So I decided to run an informal experiment where I'd have her play a handful of titles and see how she approached figuring each one out in hopes of getting a better
Whoa.
understanding of how people learn the language of video
Okay.
games. In an effort to not influence how she approached any given title, I didn't give her any advice or instructions. I just watched, silently judging. I had her play through the early sections of 9 games: Super Mario Bros., Shovel Knight, Celeste, Portal, Doom, Skyrim, The Last of Us, Uncharted
enough.
2, and so that I could really test the strength of our marriage,
only that.
Dark Souls. I picked these titles because A, I felt there would be a solid sampling of 3 major types of games, those being 2D platformers, 3D platformers, and first-person shooters/adventures, while also offering a diverse spread of genres and gameplay mechanics, and B, I like them. So, this is how it went. Just kidding, we're still. With each game, I noticed that there were a vast amount of seemingly basic functions and mechanics that she either didn't fully grasp or know existed. This first came up with Mario 1-1. She figured out the jump easily enough, but never realized she had the ability to dash, making her time at the level pretty hard to watch. There are no in-game instructions on how to dash or do anything else really, so players will only learn about it if they read the instruction manual, figure it out through experimentation, or have another person tell them how it works. As she didn't even know it was something she could do, she never figured it out. To me, it has become second nature to practice whether or not I know it's an option. I just assume it will be, guess the command would probably be the B button or equivalent. But I only make that assumption because of years of being conditioned to make it. Figuring out the controls for all of the games, whether they were explicitly explained or implicitly taught through level design, was a challenge for her. Part of this stems from her not being all that comfortable with the controller. Anytime a game asked for her to press a certain button, she'd look down at the controller and search for it. One of the most memorable instances of this came up while playing The Last of Us. Early on, there's a prompt on the screen to press L3, which she couldn't find on the controller as there is no button labeled L3. She noticed it was shaped like a circle, so she guessed it might be one of the joysticks. However, she didn't know that it meant to press down on it, so she just sort of moved back and forth until eventually figuring it out. I've certainly played games that do a better job of illustrating how L3 and R3 work, but it is kind of weird that there's pretty much a hidden button on all controllers that new players will have no reason to know exists.
That's a good
Figuring
point.
out a game's controls sounds easy, but she essentially not only had to memorize which buttons did what, but also which buttons were where, adding another layer of things to keep track of and making the process a little bit more overwhelming. She typically fared better with games that didn't give too much information to remember. With Dark Souls, after reading 15 or so messages explaining the controls, she said she felt like she was getting too much information too quickly. A lot of the things she learned, most notably the lock-on feature, she forgot about by the time they would actually be useful. On the other side of things, with Shovel Knight, she struggled to get through a few of the early sections because she didn't understand the full scope of her abilities or how to use them, but once she did start to figure things out through experimentation, she ended up remembering the core mechanics better because she witnessed firsthand how useful they could be. So for her at least, giving a memorable use of a mechanic made it stick in her mind a lot clearer. Most of the games I had her play were with a controller, but I did want her to have some experience with mouse and keyboard, so I had her try a few games with a first-person perspective. I thought Portal would be the best place to start as it doesn't call for reflexes and gives players time to figure things out. Using the keyboard actually proved to be easier for her than the controller as she uses the keyboard every day and knows where everything is. However, if you've been paying attention to the footage, you've probably noticed that she isn't looking around her, and that's because she didn't realize she was supposed to use the mouse.
Oops.
In fairness, the instructions at the start explain how to move and how to pick things up, but they do assume that players will just know to use the mouse to move around. Given that she doesn't spend her free time watching me play games on my computer, why would she? I know that a lot of these little issues she ran into in regards to controls and mechanics all seem easy to overcome, and in a lot of ways they are, but they do still act as small barriers to entry for new players. Even when games have explanations for things, it can sometimes be information overload, and it isn't uncommon for people to
Divine power.
on purpose because they don't feel like reading a bunch of stuff and they just want to beat the shit out of something. A lot of titles seem to assume that players will have at least some familiarity with controls, so some of the more simple explanations are kind of just left out. And I think the way most people end up learning these basic things that they won't figure out without searching on their own is through other people. For example, back to Mario. I don't remember how I learned to sprint in the game, but as I know I would not have read the instruction manual,
Divine power!
that my brother told me how to do it, and I wouldn't be surprised if one of his friends had told him, and so on and so on. Also, the only reason I understand half the things I do in Dark Souls is because I've scoured wikis and message boards on how to get good. Video games are best when they are a communal experience, and a big part of that stems from the sharing of knowledge. Obviously, someone being a backseat gamer can get annoying if they explain how to do everything, but getting assistance when it's needed most can make a game far more enjoyable. It bridges the gap between games expect players to already know and what they actually do know. Most of the frustration that the lady I live with had while playing boiled down to not being able to figure things out that she didn't know existed, which is something that would have been solved had I not just spent time as an observer. Given that I was, though, she found herself continuing to have problems, and one of those is summed up best by her most frequently asked question. When it came to the 2D platformers, navigating wasn't especially difficult for her. Because the options were limited, it was pretty easy for her to figure out that she needed to go right and sometimes up. Celeste and Shovel Knight do have a few optional rooms players can go in, but for the most part, whenever she entered one, she could tell it wasn't the path she wanted to take. Although Shovel Knight does have a side room in the tutorial that heads to the right and seems like the main path despite not being it, and there was a fair amount of disappointment as she realized she did all that work for nothing.
Are you fucking kidding me?
However, for all the 3D games, navigating proved far more difficult. She spent a lot of time wrestling with the camera in third-person games, and she wasn't all that great at moving and looking around at the same time in first-person ones. Due to her not rotating the camera around a ton, she didn't always get a great sense of her surroundings, so she struggled with figuring out where she was and
that?
where she was going. Like in Skyrim, she missed the jump from the tower to the house near the tutorial, and it took a while for her to realize that she had fallen back to the spot where she started. Also, because she wasn't good at focusing her camera, she didn't realize she was supposed to be following a bar, so she was sort of just storming along, trying to get out of the city in her own way. Once she did follow him and got into the building, she was more interested in picking up everything she saw instead of moving forward, which actually is fair in how most people play Skyrim. Either way, she wasn't fully sure where to go. Interestingly, after we finished all the games, I brought up the footage of Skyrim and showed her the compass at the top of the screen, and she said that she hadn't noticed it while playing, as she was mostly just focused on what was directly in front of her. The same thing happened with Doom's compass and even the health bars of enemies and bosses in Dark Souls. She typically noticed waypoints on the screen when they showed up, but she didn't know what they were for, so she often ignored them. Players are hit with a lot of information when they play games, and for ones who aren't all that comfortable with the basics, a lot of that information is pushed to the side, acting as another barrier for entry. Another thing that confused her was when progression in a level wasn't entirely linear. Like with Dark Souls, she got confused when the level looped back around on itself, and she made the assumption that she had messed up and gone the wrong way. Most of the games she had played before Dark Souls had progression, so finding herself back near where she started felt odd. Even the 3D games that seemed like they might be more straightforward had a few things that ended up being confusing for her. For example, in Uncharted 2, what a player can climb is indicated by being colored yellow, but that wasn't obvious to her, so she constantly tried to climb things that just looked like they could be climbed. And then she questioned why she had to take the longer, more roundabout path when there were perfectly good handholds right above her. A similar issue with signaling happened with The Last of Us as well. There's a part where the player has to run through a city to escape, and a gas station explodes, causing street lamps and other things to block the road ahead. My wife noticed a little gap on the sidewalk that was untouched by fire, so she kept trying to run through that to get out. But every time she did, the infected came and killed her. This made her think that the issue wasn't with it being the wrong way to go, but rather with her not being fast enough. So she kept trying that same path over and over before finally finding the right way. With game design, there's often a battle between having a level look realistic and making it easy to navigate. In this example, Naughty Dog tried to make the city feel more natural by not having every path be physically blocked off. And while more experienced players will most likely see the explosion and assume they should go a different way, the game falls short on helping players who don't understand what they're supposed to do. By having the signal be the explosion, but the consequence being an attack by the infected, she learned the wrong lesson. And this sort of thing ended up happening to her a fair amount throughout the process, even with things that had nothing to do with navigation. Sometimes she just interpreted the information the game was giving her in the wrong way, and she found herself. The idea that some games teach players how to play simply through gameplay and level design is a pretty common talking point in the video game community. I'm a firm believer that a lot of games do this, and watching her play reaffirmed that thought. For example, in Doom, her initial instinct was to stay as far away from enemies as possible, because she didn't feel all that comfortable with the controls of the first-person shooter. However, once she came across enemies with fireballs at her from a distance that did way more damage than anything she could do from that same range, she started to realize that her best bet was to get close to enemies and either beat the crap out of them or use the shotgun. Ultimately, Doom is meant to be played this way. The glory kill system and the handful of weapons that are powerful at close range are included to push a fast-paced, action-packed fighting style. And having one of the first rooms be extremely difficult to beat without playing this way sets the expectation for the rest of the game. It took her a fair bit of banging her head against the wall to get past this room. But once she did, she was better at the core mechanics of the game than when she started. With that said, what I found even more interesting than when she learned the right lessons of how to play a game through gameplay was when she learned
Okay, yeah, I'm not getting all that.
I noticed happened while playing Mario 1-1. At the beginning of the level, there's a question mark box with a mushroom in it. She had some familiarity with the Mario franchise, so she knew that mushrooms were a good gift. However, after hitting the box, she jumped into a different block, causing the mushroom to change directions and go off the left side of the screen, out of reach. She didn't register that she had caused the mushroom to change directions, leading her to the assumption that mushrooms would always end up going to the left. When she got to another block that she suspected held the mushroom, she hit it and immediately moved to the left before it went off screen, and, well... this was a far less intrusive lesson to get wrong than the ones that came up while she played Celeste and Shovel Knight. The tutorial of Celeste is a pretty simple stage that ends with the player learning how to dash, which is arguably the most important and useful mechanic in the game. The lady I live with interpreted the prompt to mean that the only way to dash was by doing it at an upward angle, pretty much crippling her ability to do screens effectively until after 15 minutes or so when she accidentally dashed horizontally and realized her moveset was wider than she had thought. With Shovel Knight, early on she died from hitting this bubble. A bag of gold popped out and hovered near it. On her next time through, she jumped on the bubble and the bag at the same time,
poor
and
leg.
assumed that both things had damaged her, causing her to think that the bags of gold were an enemy of some sort. So when she came across them after that, she would either try to attack them or actively avoid them. As she wasn't paying terribly close attention to the HUD, she never realized what they actually did. I'm not saying that these things are the faults of the game developers, but it is
Divine
interesting that
power.
information on screen can be misunderstood. These sort of things can happen to players of all skill levels, but given her lack of experience, she didn't have much else to go on to challenge the lessons she thought she had learned. I found the disconnect between how she thought games worked and how they actually worked to be pretty intriguing. And as I focused more on those differences, I started to notice a sort of trend with every title she played, that being when most people talk about what any video game is like, there's often a greater focus on the general actions players can do rather than the limitations that may be possible in terms of function. For example, Mass Effect can be described as a role-playing game where, among other things, players get the opportunity to talk to and form relationships with various characters across the universe. People who play a lot of games will most likely go in understanding that this actually means players will be able to form relationships with a predetermined cast of characters by choosing responses from a set of limited dialogue options. As it turns out, this formula makes for a really great series, but there is a gap between what a game sounds like and what it actually looks like. And I think for people who don't end up playing a lot of games but have to suffer through listening to their friends or partners talk about them, they get a warped perception about what players can do in a title because they don't understand or know the systems that games use in order to give these grand sounding experiences. Where I know to apply a sort of video game logic to any title I play, the lady I live with was always trying to apply real world logic. Like in the Doom tutorial, there's a gore nest that the player needs to destroy.
See you soon.
A waypoint marker shows up on it, which when I first played, I knew meant I needed to go up to it and most likely hit a button prompt. When my wife played, she didn't know what the marker meant, so her initial instinct wasn't to walk right up to it. Instead, she noticed while messing around that the red barrels exploded, so she had the idea to try to push one of the barrels towards the nest to blow it up. And this is objectively more interesting than just pressing a button to destroy it. But of course, it didn't work. Throughout the various games, a pretty common question she asked was, why can't I do it this way? And my response was, because. The deeper answer is that limitations exist in games because there are only so many potential inputs a title can have, meaning there are a finite number of ways a player can interact with things. If developers tried to program in every possible way a player might think about interacting with something, games would just never come out. I'm used to these limitations. I actually appreciate them in a lot of instances. However, for her, she got frustrated when the ideas she came up with didn't work. Like while scaling the train in Uncharted 2, she reached a point where she wanted to swing from a pipe and through a window. So when she realized she had to take the predetermined path that didn't take much more than pressing left, she felt disappointed because, yeah, her idea was cooler. In Skyrim, as Alduin began attacking the city, she found a spot in a house and figured she'd just wait it out until he left. But due to the scripted nature of this part of the game, that plan didn't work, forcing her to follow the path the game wanted her to follow. In turn, this took away all the tension of the section because she knew she could take as long as she wanted and nothing bad would happen. Hiding in a house isn't that fun of a way to play a game, but her not being able to made it feel like she lost some agency. Her expectations for what she thought she could do in each game were always different than the reality, and I think as she realized that games were more simple than she had first assumed, some of the intrigue about them faded. For the lady I live with, the thing she hated more than anything else about this experiment
like how he says that.
play sections of a level over and over again after dying. Had I not told her to keep trying on a handful of the game, she would have stopped far sooner.
Are we skipping Cassia?
With that said, when she did stick with games that frustrated her
Why?
and ended up beating the parts that she struggled with, she found it exhilarating. I think this trade-off of dealing with frustration so that the excitement of beating something is all that much sweeter is one that people who play a lot of games not only understand, but look for. However, trying to pitch that she should spend her free time doing something that actively frustrates her so that the few moments where she succeeds feel glorious is a bit of a tough love. This little test has me questioning how I became interested in video games in the first place. I don't remember how they became such a big part of my life. I don't know how I got to the point where I could look at a compass at the top of the screen and know what to expect from every marker without looking them up. I don't know how I first learned about stamina bars and the various ways to make sure I don't run out of energy. I don't know how I became, I guess, fluent in the language of video games. I'm just glad that I learned the basics when I was young enough to not care about spending hours on one level. For
Yeah.
a better understanding of
Me
how
too.
inexperienced players approach video games, I need to run a much wider and more complex study that tests in a more robust way than just sitting down to watch my wife play video games a few times. But I did find it interesting to compare how wildly different my approach to games is to hers. And while I definitely don't have enough definitive information to make any sort of legitimate conclusion about how inexperienced players approach games, I do want to say this. In a similar way to how it is harder to learn a language as an adult, it's harder to get into video games after a lifetime of not playing them. And from what I've seen, that seems to have less to do with interest and more to do with struggling to get over the barriers that exist for new players. Like, if you don't know how to read, why would you pick up a book? What I'm getting at is if someone you know who doesn't play games expresses interest in trying one, don't force them to be an
Hey,
expert, where you give no guidance and mostly just watch them struggle with something that they never learned how to do. Teach them how to read it instead.
Oh, he wants it.
Fucking get it.
You can use that to like wait
Don't put that video.
Just in time.
Okay, let me ask you a question. How often do you finish a game with an inventory that looks something like this? It happens to me all the time, and that's because I almost never use consumable items. While there are a few exceptions, pretty much as soon as I get one, it sits in my inventory gathering dust. And that has me wondering, is this a fault with the way a lot of games are designed, or is it a problem created by players like me? So, join me as I explore
No
whether or
problem. Well,
not
classic. You actually require to use
while
consumables.
consumable items operate differently across various games and genres, one common factor always holds true. The more often a player is put into a situation where they need to use an item, the more often they will use that item. Which, yeah, duh. Items that address specific problems like having low health or suffering some sort of status ailment get used frequently because A, players are put at a huge disadvantage if they don't address the issue, and B, it's obvious when players should use them. The character is poisoned, use an antidote, or lose health every few seconds. If cursed, use a purging stone, or have half HP. If blinded, use eye drops, or miss every single attack. By providing a clear solution to a problem, players know that as soon as an issue arises, they need to address it. These are what I'll call reactive items, which, as the name suggests, are items that react to some sort of affliction. Of all kinds of consumables, reactive ones are what I find myself using the most, especially in early parts of a game before I found more reliable ways like spells or gear to deal with the problem. On the other side of things are what I'll call active items, which are items that the player uses to gain some sort of advantage, whether it be augmenting a character's stats and abilities or putting an enemy at some sort of disadvantage from a debuff or damage. These kinds of items are usually the most interesting because unlike reactive items, which really just set a character back to where they started, active items can change up gameplay, allowing for more ways to interact with the world. Essentially, reactive items sustain, while active items enhance. Despite that, I almost never use active items because in most games I never need to. I wait and wait for a moment where I will, but more often than not, that moment never comes because most games seem to be designed to be beaten without needing any sort of boost. Active items are meant to make various situations easier for players, but if the game is already relatively easy, then there's no real reason to use them. Why waste an item when hitting baddies with a sword gets the job done? So my question is, what can games do to encourage players like me to use active items more often? The best answer I have is by disrupting the repetitive yet effective strategies players fall into, and one of the best ways to do that is by adding difficulty spikes throughout a game. There are a ton of different ways to make a game more difficult, and every game will call for a different solution. But regardless, for active items to matter, there needs to be some sort of urgency to use them, which difficulty can provide. When players actually have something to lose by not using an active item, they will use them more frequently. I've started to get into the habit of choosing harder difficulties whenever I get the option to, because I find they typically push players to interact with more in-game systems than easier modes do. Take The Witcher 3. In it, Geralt can create and drink potions and decoctions which do everything from giving him health to increasing the amount of damage he does while on horseback. The effects are vast, and a lot of them are useful in very specific situations. Each potion and decoction has a different toxicity level, making it so Geralt can only use a certain amount before being poisoned and losing health, meaning the player really needs to prioritize what they are choosing to have Geralt drink. On my first playthrough, which was on normal, I found myself really only using the health potion, because I was able to muscle my way through everything fairly easily, and I didn't want to spend time gathering supplies to make consumables that would only make things feel easier. This bummed me out because I like the idea of researching a monster's strengths and weaknesses and then gathering supplies to create something that would be effective against them, but doing it never seemed like a good use of my time. Since then, I started a file on higher difficulty and had an entirely different experience, one where I constantly found myself crafting potions and oils in order to not get obliterated by every enemy in the world. I interacted with systems and items that I had previously ignored, and I enjoyed the game much more because of it. My experience with The Witcher 3 helped me realize that active consumables often act as a way to accommodate different kinds of players, and to get the most use out of an item, players need to know what difficulty is right for them. For whatever reason, I've always found it daunting to choose a difficulty above normal on my first playthrough, but with most games, playing on normal just leads me to fall into easy and uninteresting patterns until I beat them. I think adding more customization to difficulty could make things less daunting. Instead of just having progressively harder modes where everything becomes more difficult, a lot of games could benefit greatly from having different elements that the player can toggle. For example, Dragon Quest XI gives players a variety of options, from earning less experience points for easy fights to not letting the player flee from battles. A system like this lets players consider what
From
aspects
does
of the
that.
difficulty they would like to engage with, allowing
Yeah,
them
like
to curate a challenging experience without
enemy,
having to suffer through aspects they don't
density
want to deal with,
and
like enemies with absurdly high
how
health,
complex the
just
ships are.
time-consuming. With more customization, players can find that perfect balance that gets them to engage with every aspect of the game. On top of difficulty, it's also good when games give an item multiple purposes. A solid example of this comes from the greatest Earthbound-inspired RPG ever made, Lisa. One of the major consumables in Lisa is called Joy. Any character who uses it becomes incredibly powerful for a handful of turns, which can be a lifesaver due to how difficult the encounters are. What makes Joy even more interesting is that characters become addicted to it, and if they don't get another fix, they'll go through withdrawals and become less powerful for a handful of turns. This gets the player to think a lot about Joy management. If they don't control the pace of each battle, the party can get messed up quickly, and in some cases, characters can permanently die, making Joy an incredibly useful way to get out of a bad spot. It also gets players to consider if it is best to save Joy only for those tough situations, or to use it more often in order to avoid characters going into withdrawal. Even if the player chooses not to use Joy, there are moments in the game when the main character is forced to have it, meaning no matter what, he will go through withdrawals at some point.
Divine power.
By giving Joy both active and reactive aspects, Lisa solves issues common with both kinds of items. It gives players a reason to use Joy because it remedies a problem, and it leads to a more interesting result than just being back to normal. Along with this, Lisa ties Joy into its
Divine
character.
power.
It's a commodity that is constantly talked about, and players are regularly reminded that using it will lead to ruin. But they are also put into situations that are exceedingly difficult to get through without it, acting as an interesting view of addiction. When done right, consumable items can have a major impact on both gameplay and narrative, creating full experiences more personalized to the player. Of course, there are other ways games can make active items feel more important aside from difficult encounters.
That voice actor names are
They
A's.
made nearly every item in the game a consumable item. Swords, shields, food, elixirs, all of them have limited uses, which admittedly can be a little frustrating at times, but it does get players in the mindset that nothing is too precious to hold on to forever. On top of this, it is really easy to replenish supplies, making it so there is no real fear about wasting something useful. Furthermore, the low durability of Link's weapons often leave players with a weak arsenal, making it far more important to power Link up through food and elixirs to get through certain situations.
Yeah.
Breath of the Wild also creates optional obstacles that can really only be overcome with active items. For example, dishes and elixirs that increase speed and stamina make it possible for Link to get to places that would otherwise be out of reach, which in turn almost always leads to some sort of useful secret and reward. Lastly, due to the fact that Breath of the Wild doesn't require players to complete any sort of quest line in order to beat the final boss, it is possible to just stock up on active items that allow Link to hit harder, move faster, and glide longer to beat the game.
I like that.
All of these things give players a lot of choices in how they want to play, while also providing good reasons to use consumable items. With all of this said, it's really hard to strike the perfect balance that encourages players to use active items. If a game makes things too easy, players won't need them, but if it makes things too punishing, players will be afraid to waste them. Ultimately, the best way to get players to use the various things in their toolkit is by providing challenges where they need to think creatively. Challenges that have and require many different solutions.
I
When
think I'm
games
done
don't
for
have
today.
these challenges, using consumable items just makes an easy task even easier. So to go back to my